From torturous rulers to deranged conquerors. Stay tuned to number 1 to find out the worst people in history that you might have a link to in your DNA. Number 10. Countess Elizabeth Bathory. This Hungarian noblewoman makes the devil himself look like a peaceful saint. She is said to be part of the Dracula inspiration because, well, she drank blood. But she also ate meat. And not just any meat, but that from the people she tortured. Ms. Bathory was just truly gruesome. It turns out she got her kicks by endlessly torturing young girls. We're talking needles under the nails, burning their flesh, and covering them in honey and letting the bugs get to them. Oh, and we forgot to mention, she'd sometimes bite chunks of these live girls to eat. She even made one poor girl cook a chunk of her own flesh and eat it. She is known to kidnap the peasant girls around town and had a body count of around 650 individuals. So why wasn't she stopped? Well, she was nobility and only picking on the poor girls, so the wealthy didn't want to rock the boat. However, her available stock must have run out, because then she began taking the daughters of nobility, and that, you see, was totally uncalled for. Though she was found guilty, her punishment was not even death. It was to live out the rest of her life alone in one room of her castle. She and her husband did have 2 children though, so you might want to have one of those DNA tests and make sure you're not a descendant of hers. Number 9. Nero. Before we talk about the insanity of Nero, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Be sure to click that ever-important notification bell while you're there. Oh, and like this video. One of Rome's emperors, Nero didn't stand much of a chance of sanity from birth, since his mother was crazy. She slept with and murdered her way through her own family in order to get Nero into power. So it shouldn't come as much of a surprise to know that Nero inherited the homicide bug. One of his victims? His own mother. Nero actually started out as a fair ruler who was uncomfortable with death sentences and secret political meetings. The feeling of power eventually got to him. The world was his oyster, and he felt that he could do anything. Lead Rome, act on stage, romance the ladies. Oh, and kill his own wife because he wanted someone else's wife. When Rome burned to the ground, Nero took the opportunity to plan a ginormous Greek-themed palace for himself, as opposed to the rest of the townfolk who were left desolate and weeping. Most history books state that he himself set the fire, while he places the blame on the Christians. Nevertheless, his dysfunctional reign ended with suicide. All in all, quite a classy guy to have in your heritage, right? The only good news here is that it's unclear if any of his legitimate children survived childhood, but it is thought that he may have had a few illegitimate children that might just be in your family tree. Number 8. Ivan the Terrible. Anyone whose name contains the Terrible should automatically set off warning bells. Ivan was the first Tsar of Russia and technically inherited his crown at the age of 3. His mother ruled for him until her death 5 years later, which then resulted in a battle of the noble families for power. All this deceit, neglect, and struggle for power that he grew up with was most likely a contributor to how paranoid Ivan became of traitors during his reign. Some stories even mention him torturing animals as a child, which, as we all know, doesn't usually result in the person growing up to be a priest. His brilliant but disturbed mind became worse when his first wife died, because he started wondering if she had been murdered. Ivan's logical solution was to create a Russian police force that executed anyone he deemed a traitor or simply worthy of being executed. He ruined the lives of the various noble families he despised and killed his own son in a fit of rage. But other than that, we're sure he was a swell guy. With his 8 known children, there just might be a connection to this terrible guy in your family history. Number 7. Gilles de Reyes. Born into wealth, Gilles was a brave soldier who fought alongside Joan of Arc and became the Marshal of France. But perhaps he wasn't so much brave as he was bloodthirsty. You see, Gilles was also a serial killer. It seems his killing didn't start until after his military retirement, so perhaps the war quelled his desires, or perhaps it ignited them. He married a wealthy woman, loved the arts, and had tons of land. Rumors claim that he was the inspiration for the fairy tale Bluebeard about a murderous husband who hid the bodies from his wife. Being rich and bored, he did the most logical thing. He took up Satanism as a hobby. The historical chain of events is a bit fuzzy, but it seems as though his killing spree began after this. Wanting to appease the demons to get more wealth and power, he tried children's sacrifices. In the end, it is estimated that he killed over 100 children, and it wouldn't be stomach-churning enough to just kill them. No, Jill tortured them first, and sometimes he tortured them again after he killed them. If Jill shows up in your family tree, we suggest amputating the entire branch. Number 6. Timur. Also known as Tamerlane, Timur was part of the Turkicized Barlas tribe in what is now known as Uzbekistan. And unless you actually paid attention in history class, you're probably scratching your head wondering what we're talking about. Basically, it was a subgroup of the Mongols, led by the ever-pleasant Genghis Khan, but we'll catch up with him later. Timur was part of Genghis's son's troop for a while. There were many struggles for power, where he first pledged his alliance to his brother-in-law, only to later kill him and take over as ruler. Cue the fighting and taking over of more land, followed by more fighting and more taking over of land. He amassed quite the resume over his famous reign. So why would one not be proud of their lineage connection to Timur? Well, no one gains that much power without having a few skeletons in their closet. Well, let's try about 17 million skeletons. Yep, that's the estimated number of people that he or his troops killed during all their battles and fights over land. Oh, and the animals weren't safe either. One legend says that when Indian troops sent soldiers on top of elephants covered in chainmail, Timur then covered his camels in hay, set them on fire, and prodded them along to scare the elephants away. We're sure the camels appreciated that one. Number 5. Tomás de Torquemada. Perhaps you recall a period in history called the Spanish Inquisition. Well, it was basically led by Tomás, who thought much of himself and was also tight with the king and queen. Therefore, he felt it was entirely appropriate to use his position to oust anyone unwilling to be Catholic. Of course, he didn't just boot them out of the country. That would be mildly humane. Nope, he felt that they should be killed. More specifically, tortured and killed. More than 2,000 people were burned at the stake during this horrific little project Tomás started. This led to the king and queen at least allowing the non-Catholics to escape. At least they had some compassion. Number 4. Caligula. After hearing about Nero, it shouldn't come as much of a surprise that his nephew might have been a tad unhinged as well. Caligula's real name was actually Gaius Caesar Germanicus. Caligula was a nickname he received as a child. When he first came into power, he became ill. Some people believe that the illness did something to him, changing the kind of person he became. Others believe he had epilepsy, which could also have affected his brain. Regardless of all this, when Caligula was in power, he was cruel. He brought back treason trials, killed people that helped him get into power, and became overly affectionate with his sisters. One sister in particular, whom he even wanted to marry, though she was already married to a non-family member. So when his sister died, he decided the logical next step would be to murder her widowed husband. Even his military mission seemed quirky. Sometimes he would have his troops loot and destroy the village, while other times he had them collect seashells to show he was the ruler of the ocean. Either way, you'd probably prefer the incestuous madman to stay clear of the family genes. Number 3. Genghis Khan. Back to Genghis Khan. Little could probably be said about him that you don't already know, but definitely check out our video on his history. Coming from humble beginnings, he got a bunch of nomadic tribes to work together. This led him to being their leader, which led them to taking over more land. Genghis Khan's name is definitely synonymous with ruthless conquering. In some ways, he was one to be admired, since his intelligence and bravery created a combination that led to massive victories. However, you only admired him if you were on his side, because if you weren't on his side, all bets were off. Genghis Khan would give his enemies one chance to surrender, and if they refused, they were annihilated. And by annihilated, we mean completely and utterly decimated. He is said to have killed throughout all his battles over 40 million people. Many alleged stories exist of the kinds of torturous deaths he might have inflicted. Leaders were never left alive, and grudges were never left unsettled. He even killed his own half-brother when he was 13 because he stole Genghis's fish. He also left behind an insane number of children. It's currently estimated that over 16 million people alive today are a part of his very large family tree. Number 2. Maximilien Robespierre. Be sure to keep all the knives and cutlery away from Uncle Maximilian if you find him hanging out in your family tree. He had a teeny tiny obsession with the guillotine. Another one with a suspected break in his mental state, he started off with noble ambitions, equality for all classes, no racial discrimination, and a ban on the abuse of power. He fought for the king to be executed, but eventually led what was known as the Reign of Terror. This reign involved mass executions, with death by guillotine of course. Maximilian felt it was all for the greater good, as he beheaded those he distrusted and killed thousands during battles. The public eventually saw his rule as that of a dictator and put the kibosh on Mr. Max. Number 1. Attila the Hun. Attila has been described as a barbarian and even killed his own brother for more power. That's pretty much him in a nutshell. His birth name meant the Scourge of God, and he was quoted as saying that wherever he had been, the grass would never grow again. A modest man, don't you think? His life was spent constantly trying to conquer more land. The Great Wall of China was partially built to keep him and his men out because they were that feared. And he tried to take over Rome because the emperor's sister sent him a letter asking for help getting out of an arranged marriage, which he interpreted as a proposal. She claimed this was a misunderstanding, which then prompted Attila to try to destroy every living thing in Rome. However, that was his one and only defeat. One legend says that before the battle was over, he tried to create a bonfire to burn himself, because he'd rather die undefeated than lose. It's not surprising that a man with this reputation wasn't a kind conqueror. If Attila came through, no one was left standing. And by no one, we're not just talking about grown-ups. He had many wives, and therefore probably a decent amount of offspring. Cross your fingers that his barbaric DNA didn't take over your family tree, too. Who did you think was the most despicable? Let us know in the comments below, and take care.